The night was quiet enough to hear the creak of the old saloon sign swaying in the wind, quiet enough to catch the faint call of a coyote far off in the desert hills. The village lay small and weathered, a cluster of wooden houses with lamps, burning dim behind curtains. Dust still clung to the main street, though no wagon had rolled through for hours. Folks here lived by simple rules: work hard, keep your word, and try to stay clear of trouble. But trouble had a way of finding people, especially in the wild stretches of the American frontier where law traveled slow and hearts were tested daily. He rode into town just past sundown, his boots hitting the ground with the weight of a man who had seen more than he cared to tell. A cowboy by trade, his horse was lean but sturdy, carrying the scars of long trails and harder days. He wasn't the kind to talk much, and when he did, his words carried more grit than polish. Folks noticed. His eyes, though steady, watchful, like a man who could read a storm in the sky before anyone else smelled the rain. And it was that same sense, that same instinct, that made him notice the strange stir at the edge of town down by the river bank. Where the moonlight spilled silver on the water, a small crowd had gathered. The sheriff's deputy stood tense, his hand hovering near his holster. Beside him, two townsmen whispered, their voices sharp with fear and judgment. In the center of it all, an elderly Apache woman stood trembling, her long hair streaked with gray, her hands bound with rope like she was some outlaw. Her face was lined with years of struggle, but her eyes carried fire, the kind that refused to bow even when the world tried to break her. The cowboy paused, narrowing his eyes. He had seen enough frontier justice to know when things weren't right. Rumors traveled fast out here, and the Apache were blamed for every missing cow, every stolen chicken, every shadow that spooked the children. Most of the time, folks didn't care if the truth was different. They wanted someone to point at, someone to punish. And tonight, it looked like this frail grandmother had become the target of their fear. Best not get mixed up in it, Han. Old ranch hand muttered near the well, chewing tobacco and shaking his head. But the cowboy's boots carried him forward anyway. Something about the sight, an old woman who could have been anyone's grandmother, standing alone against the crowd, lit a fire in his chest he couldn't ignore. He didn't know her name, didn't know what story the townsfolk had cooked up, but he knew a thing or two about unfair fights. The deputy raised his voice, steady but cold. She was caught near the barn after dark. Folks say she was scouting for her people. Can't take chances. You know what happens when we let one slip by. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others just uneasy. The cowboy studied the woman's face. She wasn't afraid, not really. Tired maybe, but her gaze was locked on the stars above, like she trusted something greater than the rope around her wrists. And in that moment, she looked more innocent than anyone accusing her. He stepped forward, his spurs jingling softly, the crowd parting a little at the sight of him. He wasn't from this town, not tied by their grudges, which gave his words a strange weight. You really think she's here to harm you? He asked, his voice even, calm but edged with steel. Look at her. Does she look like someone who came to burn your barns? The deputy bristled. Strangers shouldn't meddle. You don't know these parts. Apache raids have cost lives. The cowboy didn't back down. And tying up a grandmother proves what? That you're safer? Or just crueler? The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the croak of a frog near the river. Some townsfolk looked away, uneasy with his words, but no one stepped forward to help the woman. Fear was louder than fairness here. The cowboy knew he was pushing his luck. This wasn't his fight, but walking away wasn't in him either. He unfastened his canteen and knelt by the woman, holding it to her lips despite the deputy's protest. She drank slowly, her eyes flickering with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. When she spoke, her voice was low and cracked with age. Take care of her, brave cowboy, she whispered, though who she meant was unclear. Perhaps herself, perhaps someone unseen. But the words sank into him like a promise. The deputy barked out, "Enough. Step aside before you regret it." The cowboy rose slowly, squaring his shoulders. He could feel the weight of eyes on him, the heat of tempers about to flare. He hadn't planned on starting a war with the town, but he also hadn't planned on seeing an innocent woman strung up. Somewhere deep inside, he knew the choice he made in the next breath would change everything, his life. Hers, maybe even the whole town's. The night seemed to hold its breath. The river rippled, the horses stomped nervously, and the crowd shifted, waiting. The cowboy's hand hovered near his side, not for his gun, but for the knife he carried, sharp enough to cut rope, sharp enough to start something he might not be able to finish. He looked at the old Apache woman again. Her eyes, though weary, burned like embers, and he understood she had lived through storms worse than this. Still, she shouldn't have to face this one alone. The tension thickened, every second stretching long as a desert mile. Then, just as the cowboy drew in a breath to speak, a distant gunshot cracked through the night, echoing from the hills beyond the village. The crowd froze, heads snapping toward the sound, their whispers turning to fearful gasps. The deputy's hand tightened on his holster, and in that instant, with everyone's attention pulled by the unseen danger, the cowboy moved. But whether he managed to save her, or if the gunshot signaled more trouble than even he could handle, was something the night had yet to reveal. The sharp echo of that gunshot rolled across the hills, bouncing from canyon to canyon until it melted into the night wind. The cowboy felt his hand tighten around the knife on his belt, though he didn't move yet. His horse snorted nervously by the hitching post, stamping the dirt as if it too sensed the air turning heavier with danger. The crowd shifted uneasily. Someone muttered about raiders. Another swore the Apache had come down from the ridges at last. Fear spread faster than truth, and the old woman in the ropes became more a symbol than a person in their eyes. The cowboy knew how these nights could turn. He had seen whole villages burned because men panicked at shadows, because fear turned ordinary folks into mobs. He had seen women and children forced into wagons, seen men strung up from cottonwoods because someone claimed they stole a horse. It was never about proof. Out here, suspicion was a flame, and once lit, it spread until it consumed everyone. He glanced again at the Apache grandmother. Her eyes hadn't wavered since the sound of the gunshot. If anything, they seemed steadier now, like she knew something he didn't. That troubled him. She wasn't just some old woman who had wandered too close to town. There was weight behind her silence, and he felt it like the pull of a river current. Beneath calm water, the deputy barked orders for the men to keep watch at the edge of the village. Some grabbed lanterns, others rifles. The saloon emptied as the barkeep locked the doors, and the women drew their children closer, rushing them inside. The cowboy watched it all, the way fear scattered folks into corners, leaving the weakest at the mercy of the loudest voices. He didn't move to cut her loose. Not yet. The moment had to be right. But he stepped closer, close enough to hear her. "Whisper again. They're not here for me," she said, her voice barely more than breath. "They're here for you." He felt a chill crawl up his spine. She couldn't mean him, she didn't know him. Unless she meant cowboys, townsfolk, outsiders in general. Or maybe she knew more than she let on. He wanted to ask her what she meant, but before he could, a lantern flickered at the far edge of the riverbank. Two riders appeared on the ridge above, silhouettes dark against the moon. The crowd gasped, rifles cocked, shouts rose up, and in that noise, the old woman leaned toward him again. "You must choose, cowboy. Tonight decides everything." He drew back, unsettled by her calm. He had spent years avoiding choices that tied him to anyone or anything. He rode from town to town, taking work where it came, sleeping under stars that didn't ask questions. He had learned not to linger, not to grow roots. Roots got you noticed, and being noticed brought trouble. But somehow, this one night, this one woman was pulling him into the very thing he had spent his life escaping. The riders on the ridge didn't move closer. They just watched. The deputy cursed under his breath, trying to rally men to stand guard, but nobody wanted to be the first to step into the open. Fear made them loud, not brave. The cowboy studied the figures. They weren't painted warriors ready for a raid, nor drunken outlaws looking for loot. They sat still, patient, like men measuring what sort of fight they were about to face. He had a feeling they weren't here for cattle or coin. They were here for her. He thought back to her words, "Take care of her, brave cowboy." Who had told her to say that? Who had given her into his hands? And why him, of all people? He remembered his own grandmother then, years gone, who had raised him in a cabin near the Brazos when his pa was too broke to keep a roof. She had taught him to listen before he spoke, to watch the sky for changes, to know the worth of kindness in a hard land. He hadn't thought of her in years. Yet here, staring at this Apache elder bound by ropes, he felt the echo of that old woman's lessons as sharp as if she stood beside him again. The night deepened. Clouds rolled over the moon, throwing the village into a restless darkness. Somewhere beyond the hills, another shot rang out, then silence. The riders still didn't move. And in that tense stillness, the cowboy realized the town was teetering on a knife's edge. One wrong twitch could send everyone running wild. He wanted to step back, to let them settle their own business. But his boots stayed planted. Something inside him had shifted, something that whispered he had already crossed the line the moment he offered her that canteen. The deputy turned to him suddenly, eyes narrowed. "You seem mighty interested in her, stranger. What are you hiding?" The cowboy didn't answer right away. He measured the man, the crowd, the moment. He knew how fast suspicion could turn. If they decided he was with her, they'd tie him beside her before the hour was out. But the truth didn't matter much in places like this. What mattered was what folks believed. And right now, their belief hung loose, ready to swing whichever way fear pushed hardest. He tipped his hat lower, voice quiet but firm. "I'm not hiding anything. But I reckon tying up an old woman won't keep you safe from whatever's out there." The deputy sneered. "And you think you know better than men who've lived here their whole lives?" The cowboy shrugged. "I've seen enough nights like this to know danger doesn't always come from where you expect." The silence stretched long again. The crowd didn't know whether to side with him or the deputy. Folks looked from one to the other, uneasy, shifting their weight. And all the while, the Apache grandmother stood between them, her presence turning the night into something more than just another quarrel. The cowboy thought of his own trail. He had no family waiting, no land to claim, nothing tying him to tomorrow. And yet, for reasons he couldn't explain, the thought of leaving her here felt heavier than any burden he'd carried before. The riders still watched from the ridge. The clouds broke, moonlight spilling back across the land, and for the first time, the cowboy caught the glint of metal rifles held steady, pointed toward the town. His jaw tightened. He knew then that this wasn't just about her or the town, or even him. Something larger was stirring, something that reached beyond this village of wooden houses and dusty streets. The old woman closed her eyes, whispering words in her own tongue. He didn't understand them, but the tone was clear prayer, or maybe warning. The cowboy's grip on his knife tightened. He knew the next move would set the course, and once it began, there'd be no turning back. The silence after the second gunshot stretched so long that even the cicadas seemed to fall quiet. The cowboy kept his eyes on the ridge, watching the riders who hadn't moved a muscle since they first appeared. Their stillness was more unnerving than any charge. Men who wanted to raid came down with fire and fury. Men who waited were men with a plan. He knew enough to tell the difference. The deputy grew restless, barking at a handful of townsmen to set up sentries near the barns. Lantern lights swung back and forth, throwing wild shadows on the buildings, making the whole village look haunted. A few men obeyed, but most hung back, glancing over their shoulders as if they expected arrows to come whistling out of the dark any second. The cowboy noticed the fear in their steps, the kind that made hands shake when loading rifles. Fear. Like that often turned deadly. The grandmother still stood bound, though the rope had slipped some with her shifting. She didn't fight it. Instead, she stood tall, her chin raised, as if the ropes were nothing more than threads waiting to be cut. She watched the ridge too, but her gaze held no fear. If anything, it was recognition. The cowboy caught that flicker in her eyes and realized she likely knew exactly who those riders were. He felt a knot twist in his stomach. If she was their kin, if they had come to retrieve her, the town would never listen to reason. The people here had already made up their minds that she was a threat. And yet, the longer he looked at her, the more he wondered if she wasn't the only one in danger. Maybe the whole town was, and they didn't even know a dot. As if sensing his thought, she spoke again in her low, steady voice. The land remembers. It doesn't forget what is taken. Her words carried weight, as though they had been waiting years to be spoken. The cowboy didn't reply, but he felt the truth in them. He had seen enough to know land was never simply dirt and stone. Out here, it was memory blood and bones buried beneath. The saloon owner came stumbling out then, holding a shotgun across his chest. If they come for her, we give her over. He shouted, his voice quivering. Ain't worth all of us dying. For one old woman. The deputy looked torn, glancing from the cowboy to the crowd, then to the ridge. He was young, too young for his badge, and the weight of leadership sat poorly on his shoulders. The cowboy knew men like him. They wanted to appear strong, but lacked the spine when it came time to stand alone. Best keep your mouth shut, the cowboy muttered, low enough for only the old woman to hear. But she only smiled faintly, as if she'd heard that sort of warning 100 times and never once obeyed it. The tension split the town in half. Some sided with the deputy, insisting the woman be held as proof they were protecting themselves. Others whispered that it would be wiser to hand her over before the riders turned the whole village into ash. And in the middle of it all stood the cowboy, unwilling to choose either side, though he knew the moment was coming fast. He thought back to the trails that brought him here. He remembered crossing barren stretches where the sun burned so hot it bleached bones white in the sand. He remembered nights by the campfire with men who never lived to see the next payday. He remembered the faces of innocents who suffered because someone chose fear over fairness. All those memories pressed down on him now, urging him toward action, though he hadn't yet decided what shape that action would take. The riders on the ridge shifted at last. One raised his hand in a slow signal, and another peeled away, riding down toward the river bank. The rest stayed put, their rifles still, gleaming faint in the moonlight. The lone rider approached calmly, not rushing, not threatening, just steady. The crowd grew restless, men lifting rifles but not firing, their breaths held tight. The cowboy's hand brushed his knife again. If the rider came to speak, maybe there was still a chance to keep blood from soaking into the dirt. But if the deputy made a foolish move, the hills would thunder with return fire. He could see it as clearly as a storm cloud ready to break. The rider reached the river's edge and halted. His horse was strong, painted with dust from long miles. His face was hidden by the brim of his hat, but when he spoke, his voice carried across the water with the weight of someone who had seen too much. "She is not yours," the man said. "Release her, and no harm will come." The deputy bristled. And if we don't? The rider didn't move, but the silence that followed was answer enough. The cowboy glanced at the old woman again. Her lips moved, though no sound carried. She seemed to be speaking to the rider across the river in words only they understood. The rope around her wrist slipped further, and for a moment, the cowboy thought she might free herself without any help at all. The deputy raised his rifle higher, his hands trembling. The crowd tightened behind him, ready for sparks to fly. The cowboy felt it building, the kind of moment where one pull of a trigger would turn the whole night into chaos. And yet, beneath that tension, smaller threads wove into the scene. A boy, no older than 12, peeked from behind his mother's skirts, wide-eyed at the sight of the rider. The blacksmith's wife clutched a cross around her neck, whispering prayers. The saloon keeper cursed under his breath, already thinking of the coins he might lose if the town was burned. Each of them carried their own fears, their own selfish reasons, and those reasons braided into a rope just as tight as the one around the grandmother's hands. The cowboy wondered if any of them saw her as more than a symbol, more than a problem to be solved. To him, she was becoming something else entirely, a test. Not of bravery, but of conscience. The rider across the river waited, unmoving. The deputy's breathing quickened, his voice cracking as he shouted, "This is our town. You don't give U.S. orders here." His finger twitched dangerously near the trigger. The cowboy stepped forward, placing himself between the deputy's rifle and the grandmother. His shadow stretched long in the lantern light, and for the first time, the crowd hushed. "Think before you do something you can't take back," he said quietly. The deputy hesitated, anger and fear warring in his eyes. The cowboy didn't flinch, didn't blink. He simply stood, the knife at his side, ready to cut the rope at the first chance. And all the while, the grandmother's voice echoed softly in his memory. "You must choose, cowboy. Tonight decides everything." The clouds swallowed the moon again, leaving the riverbank cloaked in shadows. Somewhere in the dark, an owl hooted low, a lonely sound that seemed to carry a warning. The cowboy kept his eyes locked on the ridge, waiting, knowing the night was far from finished. The clouds dragged heavy across the moon, throwing the land into a restless dark. The cowboy stood still, every nerve taut, the night humming with the weight of something about to break. He kept one hand near the knife at his side, the other loose, open, a signal that he wasn't reaching for his gun just yet. Across the river, the lone rider didn't move either. He sat tall in his saddle, his horse shifting beneath him, and though he spoke no more words, the silence he carried said everything. That he and the men waiting on the ridge weren't leaving without the old woman. The deputy's breathing grew sharper, his voice loud but unsteady. "I said this is our town. We'll handle our own." His rifle pointed straight past the cowboy, straight at the grandmother bound in the rope. The crowd murmured louder, torn between fear of the riders and loyalty to their own. The cowboy shifted, his boots just enough to put himself more firmly between the barrel and the woman. He didn't speak right away, knowing words sometimes lost their strength if thrown too quick. He let the silence linger until even the deputy realized how much weight was pressing down on his next move. "Lower your rifle," the cowboy said. Finally, his tone even. "You fire one shot, you'll bring the whole ridge down on us." The deputy's jaw worked, stubbornness twisting his young face. "And you'd rather let them take her? You'd let savages tell us what to do?" The cowboy's eyes narrowed. "Sometimes the wisest thing you can do is not fire." That line sat heavy in the air. Some townsfolk nodded faintly, but others shook their heads, muttering about weakness. The saloon keeper growled that the stranger was siding with the enemy. A woman near the well pulled her boy closer, whispering that maybe it was best to hand the old woman over and end it before blood spilled. The grandmother herself never flinched. She stood calm, eyes fixed on the rider across the river as though They shared some bond that went deeper than words. Her wrists were raw where the rope had rubbed, but her shoulders were straight, her expression unwavering. She was not afraid of being taken. She was not afraid of dying either. That, more than anything, unsettled the cowboy. He couldn't shake the feeling that her presence here was more than accident. The rider across the water finally spoke again. Voice low but cutting through the stillness like a blade. The land does not forget. The people do not forget. Tonight is not yours to decide. Release her. The deputy cursed, trying to bark orders, but no man moved. Their eyes were fixed. On the ridge, where faint glimmers of steel marked the rifles waiting in the dark. It was a standoff the cowboy knew too well, one spark away from flames that would consume everyone. The boy who peeked from behind his mother's skirt slipped free and darted closer to the well, eyes wide. The cowboy noticed him, heart clenching. At the foolish bravery. The boy couldn't have known the weight of what was unfolding, yet his presence in the open made the moment even more dangerous. A stray shot could cut him down before anyone blinked. The cowboy took a slow step back, closer to the grandmother. His voice dropped low, meant for her alone. "If I cut you free, will they stop?" Her answer was a whisper carried like smoke. "It is not that simple. They came because of me, but they came for more than me." That unsettled him more than any rifle on the ridge. More than her? What could be larger than this standoff? He searched her face for some hint, but she turned her eyes back to the hills, silent again. The saloon keeper spat in the dirt. "Enough waiting. Hand her over before they burn us all alive." The deputy snapped at him to shut his mouth, but the crowd was already splitting, some siding with the saloon keeper, others frozen by fear, and a handful still watching the cowboy, waiting for his move. They saw the steadiness in him, and in a night like this, steadiness meant leadership, even if he didn't want it. A third gunshot echoed from the hills, closer this time, like a warning. The horses in town jerked their heads, stamping and snorting, their nerves frayed. The boy cried out, and his mother rushed to grab him back. The cowboy felt his pulse pound hard. Every sound, every shift in the wind, was louder now, sharper. The tension was a rope stretched so thin it would snap with the slightest tug. He could feel it, the climax rushing closer, though no one yet knew how it would fall. The rider across the river lifted his hand again, palm open. It wasn't a threat. It was a demand for decision. The cowboy met his gaze across the dark water, and though they had never spoken before tonight, he understood what that look meant. Time had run out. He reached slowly for the knife, sliding it free without sudden motion. The crowd gasped, mistaking the gesture for violence. The deputy's rifle swung toward him, finger twitching. The cowboy's heart hammered, but he didn't falter. He bent low, blade flashing just enough to slice the rope at the grandmother's wrists. Her hands fell free, red and raw, but steady as stone. She didn't stumble, didn't cry out. She simply straightened, her gaze now sharper, almost commanding. For the first time, the cowboy saw her not just as a grandmother, not just as a victim, but as someone carrying the weight of an entire people. The deputy shouted, furious, his rifle lifting high, but the cowboy's stance cut him off. The strangers. Calm was more dangerous than any threat. His voice carried low, but the steel in it silenced the whole street. "You'll have to go through me first." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Fear surged, some backing away, others clenching their fists. Across the river, the rider leaned forward slightly, as though approving the choice, but before another word could fall, the sound of hooves thundered. From the hills, more riders appeared, dark shapes against the starlight, pouring down the slope like a tide. Lanterns swung wildly, shouts broke out, and rifles cocked in panic. The town erupted in motion, some scrambling for cover, others aiming blindly at shadows. The cowboy stood firm, knife still in hand, the grandmother now free at his side. The deputy screamed for men to hold the line, but their fear drowned his commands. The saloon keeper dropped his shotgun and ran, vanishing into the dark. Mothers clutched children, men cursed and stumbled, and all the while, the hoofbeats drew closer, the night swelling with their approach. The grandmother placed her hand lightly on the cowboy's arm, steadying him in the chaos. Her voice was calm, even as the world spun out of control. It was never about them taking me. It was about showing you who would stand and who would fall. Her words struck him deeper than any bullet could. The riders were nearly upon them now, dust rising, steel glinting, voices crying out in a language the town didn't understand. The cowboy gritted his teeth, shoulders squared, knowing the storm was seconds from breaking. He had lived his life. Avoiding roots, avoiding ties, avoiding choices that bound him to others. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of a village on the edge of ruin, with an old woman at his side and a crowd of frightened people behind him. He could walk away. He could let the town fend for itself. But something inside told him that whatever happened next, he was already a part of it. The hoofbeats thundered louder, so close now the ground shook. The crowd screamed. The deputy's rifle shook in his hands, and the grandmother's steady gaze never left the approaching riders. Cowboy tightened his grip on the knife, his other hand brushing near his holster at last. His heart pounded, his breath sharp in his chest. Every sense screamed that the moment had arrived, the breaking point, the storm, the reckoning. And just as the riders surged into the river's edge, the night split with a sound louder than any before, a roar of rifles, shouts, and the crash of steel against steel. The climax had come, and there would be no turning back. The roar of gunfire cracked across the riverbank, tearing the night wide open. Lanterns swung violently as men stumbled for cover. Horses screamed and reared, the ground trembling beneath the charge of hooves. The cowboy moved without thought, his body answering faster than his mind. His knife flashed in one hand, his other sweeping down to the revolver at his hip. He wasn't aiming to kill. He was aiming to survive, to protect the old grandmother now freed of her ropes and standing like an unshaken pillar in the storm. The first rider broke through the water, splashing hard as his horse surged onto the bank. The cowboy leveled his revolver, fired once, and the bullet struck the dirt just short, a warning. The rider's horse veered, but the others pressed on, dark shapes breaking into the village with cries that rattled the townsfolk's nerves. Fear finally spilled over. Men shot blindly, women screamed, children clutched their mothers. The deputy barked orders no one followed. The grandmother raised her voice then, sharp and clear, in words the cowboy didn't understand. But the effect was immediate. The riders slowed, their cries tapering, their guns not yet raised to fire. They weren't raiding. They weren't burning. They were surrounding. The cowboy realized with a jolt of clarity they hadn't come to slaughter. They had come to take back what they claimed was theirs. The deputy, young and reckless, didn't see it that way. He lifted his rifle, finger tight on the trigger. The cowboy lunged, shoving the barrel upward just as the shot rang out. The bullet tore harmlessly into the night sky, but the sound sent panic surging through both sides. More rifles cracked, splinters flying from wooden posts, sparks bursting from the blacksmith's forge. The boy screamed as his mother dragged him inside, and the saloon keeper bolted, vanishing into the shadows. The cowboy held his ground, his voice rising above the chaos. "Stop, stop before none of us walk away." His words carried through the smoke and noise, steadier than the rest. A few rifles lowered, the hesitation spreading like ripples across the river. The grandmother stepped forward now, her face illuminated by the weak lantern glow. She lifted her hands, raw from the rope but strong, and spoke again in her tongue. The riders reined in their horses, circling but not striking. The crowd of townsfolk shrank back, muttering. Some wanted to hand her over, others simply wanted the night to end. Finally, the rider who had first spoken from across the river dismounted and stepped forward. He was tall, his face weathered by sun and years, eyes dark with grief but steady with resolve. He spoke in English this time, his voice like gravel dragged across stone. She is ours. She carries our memory. You cannot bind her like a thief. The cowboy lowered his revolver, breathing hard. He turned slowly toward the townsfolk. You heard him. She's not here to burn your homes. She's here because you've forgotten she's human. Murmurs swept the crowd. Some bowed their heads, ashamed, but others scowled. The deputy's pride burned hottest. You'd let them walk in here and tell us what's right? He spat. You'd side with them over your own? The cowboy stepped close enough the young man could see the fire in his eyes. I side with what's right. That's what keeps a man standing when everything else crumbles. The grandmother moved past them both, walking slowly toward the rider who waited. The townsfolk gasped but didn't move to stop her. She placed her hand on the cowboy's arm once more as she passed. Her touch was light, but her words were heavy. You did. As the land asked, you stood. The rider bowed his head to her, then turned to the cowboy. You kept her from harm when your own turned against her. For that you are known. His tone carried no threat, only truth, and it rang through the night like a bell. The other riders circled tighter, then began to pull back, guiding their horses into the river once more. The grandmother paused, glancing over her shoulder at the cowboy. For the first time, he saw her smile. It wasn't soft, it was knowing, as though she had seen this moment long before it arrived. Then she followed her people into the dark. The sound of hooves fading into the hills. The town stood in ruins of its own making. The main street was scarred with bullet holes, lanterns shattered, smoke rising from a wagon struck in the crossfire. The deputy lowered his rifle at last, his hands trembling. He looked at the cowboy, his face pale, pride cracked into shame. You made me look weak, he muttered, but even he didn't believe the words. He turned away, unable to hold the stranger's gaze. The townsfolk dispersed slowly, some helping the wounded, others slipping into their homes with heavy hearts. No one celebrated. No one claimed victory. They had looked into the mirror of their own fear and seen what it could do. The cowboy holstered his revolver, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the night. He had stood between two worlds, neither of which he fully belonged to, and for once he hadn't walked away. He could feel the change deep inside, subtle but permanent. He had chosen Dot as dawn crept over the horizon, painting the desert in pale gold. The cowboy saddled his horse. He didn't plan to stay. He never did. But as he tightened the cinch, the boy who had peeked from behind his mother's skirts ran up, holding something in his small hand. It was a charm, a piece of bone carved with careful lines. She dropped this, the boy said softly. The Apache grandma. She wanted you to have it. The cowboy took it, turning the small piece over in his palm. It was smooth, worn by years of touch, and it hummed with a strange weight. He tucked it into his pocket, nodded once to the boy, and swung into the saddle. He rode out as the sun broke fully, casting long shadows behind him. The town faded small in the distance, but the memory of the night burned sharp and clear. He had saved her, but in truth, she had saved him too from the emptiness of drifting without cause, from the hollow comfort of never choosing. The road stretched wide before him, full of dust, danger, and questions yet unanswered. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man running. He felt like a man carrying something worth keeping, and though the trail ahead was long, he knew her words would ride with him forever. Take care of her, Brave cowboy. The meaning of those words had changed now. They weren't just about one grandmother. They were about the fragile thread of humanity that tied strangers together across land, blood, and fear. It was about choosing to stand when silence was easier. As the desert wind rose, carrying the scent of sage and sand, the cowboy tipped his hat against the morning sun and pressed his horse forward. The world would keep on testing men, towns, and whole nations. But he had faced his night, and when it mattered most, he had stood. That was the reward, greater than coin, greater than fame. A man's own conscience, clear as the sunrise, was worth every risk. And the cowboy carried it with him, knowing he'd never be the same again.